On the 5th of May 2007, a Kenya Airways Boeing 737 ran into trouble moments after takeoff from Douala, Cameroon. As the plane climbed away through driving wind and rain, it banked into an ever-steepening spiral, turning over into a high-speed dive as the bewildered pilot struggled to understand what was happening. The lives of those on board hung by a thread due to the pilot's simple yet critical oversight.
Because of the accident,
he was advised that you can't take off because there's a storm, but he insisted I need to take off.
But this wasn't an isolated incident, as 7 years prior, a Kenya Airways Airbus A310 crashed into the sea shortly after takeoff from Abidjan, resulting in 169 fatalities. This raises questions about the training procedures at Kenya Airways and whether deficiencies need addressing. The investigation would only touch the surface of the problem. Despite the tragedy, the crash highlighted the significance of minor cultural shifts in preparing pilots to combat a threat that has been endangering lives since the beginning of powered flight. But before we dive deep into the details of the crash, let's discuss Kenya Airlines. Kenya Airlines has long been one of the most respected airlines in Africa. Having weathered the 20th century without a fatal accident, the airline was partially privatized in 1996. The first flag carrier on the continent to do so, and in 2010 it became the first and to date only African airline to join the SkyTeam Alliance. It operates a modern fleet of Boeing and Airbus aircraft on routes across Africa, providing crucial services to and between poorer countries whose airlines struggle to meet the demand. But as Kenya Airways expanded rapidly through the 2000s, it found itself caught on a safety learning curve that proved to be tragically steep. In the biggest city of Cameroon, Flight 507 parked, and the people got off the plane. Nearby, storms rumbled over the airport, which happens a lot at night in Central Africa. In Douala, 108 passengers got on the plane to Nairobi, making a total of 114 including the crew. But when it was supposed to leave at 11 o'clock p.m., the plane wasn't ready, and the delays kept happening. At 11:37 p.m., Captain Wamweya decided not to start the engines because the weather wasn't good. So everyone had to wait about 20 more minutes at Douala International Airport for the wind to calm down and visibility to improve. At 11:54, the crew again requested clearance to start, and shortly thereafter, Flight 507 finally taxied to the runway. Rain was falling over the airport. "Put on your wipers," Captain Wamweya suggested to First Officer Kiuru. Kiuru flipped the switch, and the wipers swished to life. Wamweya told his young first officer off for having trouble seeing even though they had wipers. Then, the controller gave clearance to Kenya 507, saying they could climb to level 370 to Jomo Kenyatta after taking off from runway 12 using the Idiba 1E departure. First Officer Kiuru said they'd let the controller know when they were ready to go. First Officer Kiuru repeated the clearance and then indicated readiness for the next steps. Captain Wamweya paused to ensure they were properly aligned before takeoff. After 2 minutes of completing routine checks and securing the cabin, the crew positioned the aircraft on the runway. Although it was typically Kiuru's duty to handle radio communication, Captain Wamweya took the initiative to request a slight deviation from the runway heading due to weather conditions. Once Kiuru had made his standard departure announcement over the public address system, the pilots pushed the thrust levers forward to takeoff power, and Flight 507 began to accelerate down the runway. 30 seconds later, it was in the air, climbing out over the mangrove swamps southeast of the city. Neither pilot noticed that they had just taken off without clearance from air traffic control. It was a bizarre mistake that would turn out to have nothing to do with the catastrophe that followed. As soon as Flight 507 lifted off the runway, it began to turn slowly to the right without any input from the pilots. Like cars, airplanes often have a natural tendency to pull to one side, and this one was no exception. The cause of the right roll would later be put down to inherent asymmetry in the construction of the wings, along with a very slight right rudder trim setting left overdue to play in the rudder trim system. Regardless, the roll was gentle enough that it didn't pose significant challenges for the pilots. Captain Wamweya merely adjusted the plane slightly to the left whenever it started drifting to the right. Meanwhile, the crew focused on their plan to divert around the thunderstorms near the airport. Captain Wamweya selected a target heading of 132 degrees. Seconds later, he changed it to 139 degrees. His flight director, an overlay on his attitude indicator, instructed him to fly right to assume the new heading. Kiuru confirmed the selection. Wamwea expressed his intention to maintain the current course. Shortly after, Wamwea instructed to engage the autopilot in command mode. This mode allows the autopilot to fully control the aircraft based on the pre-selected parameters, such as heading. Pressing the CMD button activates command mode, directing the autopilot to follow the designated heading. But First Officer Kiuru never replied, nor did he ever press the CMD button. The autopilot remained off and the plane kept turning by itself, rolling slowly to the right as it had been ever since it took off, and yet nobody said a word. The flight directors prompted the pilots to correct their heading to return to the intended path. First Officer Kiuru, monitoring the instruments, interpreted Wamwea's actions as deliberate and adjusted the target heading accordingly, assuming Wamwea intended to make a sharper turn. Suddenly, Wamwea noticed that they were banking steeply to the right, causing him to make an exclamation of surprise. Less than 1 second later, the plane rolled through 35 degrees of bank, triggering a loud alarm. "Bank angle," the warning blared. "Bank angle." Wamwea was taken back by the steep bank and the sudden sound of the alarm. He immediately grabbed his yoke and wrenched it to the right, then back to the left, and then to the right again. The plane rapidly rolled to the right, approaching 50 degrees of the bank, way beyond the normal flight envelope. Such steep banks are only safe for fighter jets, not a commercial airplane carrying over 100 passengers. Only now did Wamwea notice that the autopilot was not engaged. He reached up and pressed the CMD button, hoping to engage it in command mode. But due to the pressure on the captain's control column, it engaged in control wheel steering, CWS for short, mode instead. In this mode, the autopilot simply holds whatever roll and pitch attitude the pilot applies using the control column. When engaged at bank angles beyond the standard limit, the autopilot in CWS mode will slowly roll the plane back to a safe 30 degrees of bank, but no farther. If Captain Wamwea had let go of the controls and let the autopilot fly the plane, even in CWS mode, it would have recovered. But when the autopilot did not immediately level the wings, he instinctively blamed the autopilot. Frustrated, he grabbed the yoke. Swinging the yoke while mashing the rudder, he sent the plane rolling to the right again, reaching 90 degrees within seconds. As the plane rolled inverted, he shouted, "We are crashing." Kiuru realized that they were in a dangerous situation as he observed the aircraft's attitude indicator showing a right roll. He urgently instructed Captain Wamwea to correct the roll by turning left. Despite Kiuru's efforts to counteract the right roll by manipulating his controls, Wamwea continued to steer the aircraft to the right. As a result, the plane entered a rapid spiral dive, descending uncontrollably from 2,000 feet at a high speed. The cockpit voice recording captured Kiuru's alarmed exclamation, the sound of an alarm, and then silence, indicating the aircraft had lost control. Kenya Airways Flight 507 pitched steeply downward and banked 60 degrees to the right, slammed into a mangrove swamp deep in the estuary of the Wari River. Traveling at 530 kilometers per hour, the 737 gouged a massive crater in the swamp, sending mangled debris, chunks of mud, and pieces of trees billowing out over a vast area. Much of the wreckage penetrated up to 5 meters into the waterlogged ground, while the wreckage rested over an area of 2,000 meters squared, coating the trees with a toxic sludge of mud and jet fuel. For the 114 passengers and crew, there was no hope. All died instantly on impact. Despite the plane crashing just a short distance outside Douala, a bustling city with 2 million residents, the incident went unnoticed in the dense swamp where it occurred shortly after midnight. It wasn't until the plane failed to reach Nairobi 5 hours later that any alarm was raised. Even then, authorities were uncertain where to begin searching. Reports of a flash and a loud noise near the village of Loladorf, about 160 kilometers southeast of Douala, prompted a major air and ground search in the area but yielded no results. It took nearly 2 days before authorities discovered that the plane had crashed not far from the city. The wreckage was found on May 6th, scattered in thousands of pieces within a muddy crater in the swamp, about 5 kilometers southeast of the airport. Nearby villagers had been aware of the crash, but communication issues delayed this information from reaching search teams until later in the search effort. When reports came in that the plane had been found, relatives initially prayed for survivors, but those hopes were quickly dashed when the first aerial images revealed the desolate crash site. It was clear that no one could have survived. 114 people, hailing from 26 different countries, were dead. Worst air disaster in the history of Cameroon. Cameroon, being a very poor country, lacked institutions to investigate a crash of this scale. Facing a disaster of unprecedented scale, the government acted quickly to form a special commission of inquiry comprised of Cameroonian and foreign experts, who would be charged with a singular goal: to explain the crash of Kenya Airways Flight 507. The first task the investigators faced was to find the black box. While the flight data recorder was swiftly located, finding the cockpit voice recorder proved to be a much more challenging task. Special equipment had to be brought in to scan the swamp water, and even after detecting the locator beacon, the search wasn't over. The cockpit voice recorder had broken into 4 pieces, with the pinger detached from the section containing the memory module. This meant investigators had to manually sift through the mud to locate the crucial chip. Finally, on June 15th, over a month after the crash, the memory module was recovered. Only then could the Commission of Inquiry begin to piece together the events leading to the tragic flight. The data from the black boxes revealed a scenario that was, at its core, not so different from a large number of previous accidents. Everything about the brief flight strongly indicated that this was a case of spatial disorientation and roll, a problem that has been plaguing aviators ever since the airplane was first invented. Pilots face a challenge when flying at night or in cloudy conditions. Without a visual frame or reference, it's hard to tell acceleration from gravity. That's why they heavily depend on instruments like the artificial horizon, also known as the primary flight display. This helps them maintain an accurate mental image of their position in space. Pilots are trained to trust the artificial horizon over their body's internal sense of balance, which can be misleading when the real horizon isn't visible. This is a genuine concern because in high-pressure situations where quick decisions are crucial, even a well-trained individual might forget their training and follow their instincts. When an airplane keeps rolling in one direction, it's a big problem because of something called the 1G turn in aerodynamics. If a plane starts rolling to the side without any control, it will naturally start turning in that direction too. But things inside the plane, like people or objects, will resist that turn because of how they're moving with the plane. This makes them feel like they're being pulled the opposite way. So even though the plane is turning, things inside it still feel like they're being pulled straight down towards the floor. For a pilot, this means that a steady roll in one direction, without reference to a horizon, is completely undetectable using normal human senses. A pilot can, however, notice a sudden change in the rate of roll, known scientifically as jerk. This fact would play a key role in the fate of Flight 507. As the 737 climbed away from the runway in Douala, the pilots would have stared into a black hole. The bad weather and uninhabited swamps provided no visual horizon from an absence of lights on the ground. Simultaneously, the plane naturally rolled to the right as a slow, steady rate, detectable only using their attitude indicators. Captain Wamwea corrected this roll at first, but he would not have been able to feel it. Instead, he would have felt the change in acceleration as the plane went from rolling right to rolling left each time he corrected. The vestibular system in his inner ear, which regulates one's sense of balance, would have interpreted this as the plane turning left from a horizontal position. Although his artificial horizon would have shown the wings level, his brain would not have agreed. Initially, he was able to overcome this disorientation, as all pilots do, by flying the plane with his instruments. The problem came when Captain Wamwea asked First Officer Kiuru to engage the autopilot. The investigators could not say for sure why the autopilot was not engaged at this point, but the most likely explanation was that Kiuru, busy interpreting the weather radar to find the best course, simply never heard him. However, the technical log had recorded a fault with the autopilot back in February, so it could not be ruled out that Kiuru pressed the button, only for the autopilot to remain off. It was ultimately a communication breakdown that escalated the situation into a serious problem. If First Officer Kiuru had been aware of Captain Wamwea's instruction, He should have checked the autopilot annunciator panel and announced whether the autopilot had engaged or not. Conversely, if Captain Wamweya noticed Kyuru's lack of response, he should have inquired about the autopilot's status. Unfortunately, neither of these crucial checks were made. Instead, a misunderstanding arose. Wamweya assumed the autopilot had taken control, while Kyuru believed Wamweya was still manually flying the aircraft. This confusion led to a critical 55-second delay where nobody intervened, allowing the smooth, steady 1G turn to persist until the bank angle reached 35 degrees. At this point, approximately coincident with the activation of the bank angle warning, Captain Wamweya suddenly realized that the plane was in a turn. But his physiological instinct would have told him that the plane was banking left because he had felt the leftward corrections during the climb, but not the right roll that prompted them. Faced with conflicting cues about which way the plane was turning, along with sudden confusion about the status of the autopilot and a loud alarm, Wamweya simply panicked and turned the wrong way. His artificial horizon was right there in front of him, indicating a steepening right bank. He had a first officer whose job was to call out unexpected indications, and yet neither of these safeguards prevented him from rolling right until the plane turned over and entered an irrecoverable dive towards the ground. First Officer Kyuru did eventually intervene, but by then, it was too late. First Officer Kyuru's statements captured by the cockpit voice recorder indicated that he was aware of the aircraft's attitude throughout the flight and did not appear to be experiencing spatial disorientation. It seemed that only Captain Wamweya was surprised by the subtle 1G turn. This raises questions. Why did an experienced captain fall for an illusion that has been recognized since the 1910s? And why didn't First Officer Kyuru take corrective action earlier? These inquiries would lead to a new line of investigation. Looking into the pilot's records, several red flags appeared in Captain Wamweya's training history. His skills were assessed as below average but acceptable, allowing him to pass his examinations, although not without difficulty. Instructors had written that he struggled with crew resource management, knowledge of systems, respect for standard procedures, instrument scans, situational awareness, and planning and decision-making. In a 2004 training flight, he was cited for failing to properly discuss a failure with the first officer. On another occasion, he was reprimanded and sent to retraining after diverting a flight due to a failure of the standby attitude indicator, a backup instrument not normally used in day-to-day operations. Captain Wamweya had some troubling personality traits that made him hard to work with. Despite not being exceptionally skilled, people who knew him said he could be bossy and arrogant, often criticizing first officers for their mistakes. Shockingly, on the flight to Douala, he called First Officer Kyuru stupid and told him to shut up, extremely unprofessional for a pilot. This behavior made it tough for Kyuru to speak up, especially in an emergency. So when the plane was in trouble, Kyuru hesitated to correct the captain, who was much older and more experienced. Sadly, this hesitation meant Kyuru didn't act in time to fix the problem before it was too late. With all these factors in mind, a picture begins to emerge of a flight that was in danger from the moment it took off. At night, in bad weather, with an overbearing but below average captain and a young, unsure first officer, the situation was ripe for confusion. The problems had already begun on the ground when the flight took off without clearance. After that, all they needed was one moment of miscommunication and a little bit of bad luck, and disaster became inevitable. Nevertheless, it was not possible to blame the accident wholly on the crew. The airline had to take its share of responsibility. Kenya Airways had all the information it needed to determine that Captain Wamweya was especially at risk of disorientation due to his history of poor communication and situational awareness. But nobody ever looked at his entire training history holistically until after the accident. Instead, each training flight was reviewed individually, preventing the pattern from being discerned. Investigators felt that Kenya Airways should have been more aware of Wamweya's shortcomings and should have avoided pairing him with a new first officer whose own training record was decidedly less than perfect. Furthermore, Kenya Airways operating procedures contained ambiguities which contributed to the poor communication on Flight 507. The procedures did not say who was responsible for engaging the autopilot or at what altitude, and they did not require anyone to call out whether the engagement was successful, even though this was recommended by Boeing. Had Captain Wamweya been trained to expect such a call, the crash might have been prevented. Well, that will be it for today's video. Share your thoughts about it in the comments below. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new updates. As always, take care and see you in the next one.